Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. Now I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. David Reidmiller. Dave is the director of the Gulf of Maine Research Institute's new Climate Center. This is a position he began last summer. And although he may be new to that role, he's certainly gained an enormous depth and breadth of experience working at the intersection between climate science and climate policy during his career. He received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Colgate University and a master's and PhD in atmospheric chemistry from the University of Washington. To me, what's interesting, given that real rigorous training, is the way he immediately began honing his skills working at the interface between science and policy. And at the Mitchell Center, that's exactly what we were created to do. We sometimes refer to it as working at the interface between knowledge and action. And so we really are interested in learning more from Dave about his work. Right after he got his PhD, he was a Congressional Science Fellow working on a wide array of climate and energy issues. After that, he was a fellow at the National Academy of Sciences, among other things, assisting in the development of America's Climate Choices suite of reports, and then at the US Department of State's Office of Global Change during the Obama administration. And as if that weren't enough, he was the United States lead science and technology negotiator for the Paris Agreement, about which I'm sure he's going to tell us more. Take it away, Dave.
Well, thank you so much, David, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day. Let me pull my slides up. All right, so I'm going to start with an overview of the UN climate talks and their sort of evolution over the past 30 years. We'll look a little bit at kind of climate targets and action from the national level at the United States. Before zooming into kind of the state and local levels, and I know there's some representatives from there on the line today, so looking forward to hopefully engaging them later on. And I'll end with some initial thinking about how we're going to be part of the solution at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute by launching our new Climate Center. So I'll start with this slide. I came across this graphic just a few weeks ago from the World Resources Institute, and it really, to me, sort of encapsulated the problem, that the source is really diffuse in making it a really kind of challenging policy problem to grapple with. And you can see sort of the inner circles are basically greenhouse gas emissions levels by country, and the outer ring is basically within those individual countries. What are the sectoral sources of those emissions? And the point in showing this is that there's no silver bullet to addressing climate change, certainly within any single country and definitely on the global scale. So the original Rio Sustainability Conference in 1992 established a couple of different environmental related negotiating bodies to really bring the world together to address some big issues. One was biodiversity, one was desertification, and the third one was climate change. So it established the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or what we call the UNFCCC. And in doing so, it formalized the so-called firewall between developed and developing countries. The developed countries being these blue Annex 1 countries, and the red countries here, the non-Annex 1 countries representing developing countries. And at the time, this was, it was a snapshot in terms of where countries were, in the early 90s. And that dynamic, which is really embodied in this common but differentiated responsibilities phrase, really served as the backdrop for the negotiations for the next 20 plus years. You'll see that in the next couple of slides. So, after getting themselves established, the countries of the world came together in 1997 in Kyoto to launch what was then the first international climate regime, under the auspices of the Kyoto Protocol, right? And this was, a very different time than it is currently, and there was a very different response, right? It was a top-down structure, right, where you had binding targets on Annex 1 countries, but there were no targets, no obligations for developing countries. And so that firewall that I just mentioned was really embodied in the whole, in the Kyoto Protocol. And as a result, you probably famously remember that the Clinton administration negotiated this protocol, and the Senate failed to ratify it when we brought it home. And the Bush administration basically sort of hammered that point home. A dynamic that has echoes in modern day as well, which we'll come to a little bit later on. So fast forward to kind of the late noughts, if you will, and we're in a different time now, right? This is after an era of incredible economic growth, not only in China, but in a number of emerging economies in those non-Annex 1 countries. And a growing recognition that, it's not just developed countries or Annex 1 countries that are sort of the source of the problem, even if they do have very large historic responsibilities because of the emissions they've released over the past century or so. And in Copenhagen, we were close. We were close to coming together to get that new international climate regime, where you would have kind of non-binding targets, but for all countries. And so there really was kind of a growing recognition that, this is a global collective action problem and we all need to kind of do this together. However, there were differentiated transparency requirements. And what that means is that there were different reporting requirements, different mechanisms by which developed countries versus developing countries would be kind of held accountable for what their actions were going to be. And, as is often the case in many of these UN negotiations, there was enormous pressure, particularly from developing countries and the least developed countries, to really mobilize finance and public finance in particular, to really help them address climate change. And part of that is to help them leapfrog fossil fuel technologies as they kind of grow their economies. Can we, just like they did by leapfrogging landlines to go straight to cell phones, can we do the same thing with renewables deployment? And it ultimately resulted in the creation of the Green Climate Fund that was central to the passing of the Paris Agreement as well. So before we get to Paris in and of itself, I think it's important to recognize how complicated the negotiating dynamics are. This is a plot that I think I can't even remember now, it was either an Australian or New Zealand negotiator had pulled together at some point. And it's several years old now, but frankly, the dynamics don't change all that much. And it gives a sense of just how many different interests are at play and how much different coordination occurs at different levels, and how that coordination and strategizing can complicate or facilitate consensus in the UN climate negotiations. Broadly speaking, though, there are a couple big groups to be aware of. I mentioned the Annex 1 countries on the far left here. You can see them. Two big buckets, basically the EU and the so-called umbrella group, which is, you can see the countries there, all major emitters of greenhouse gases. The other large group, the kind of non-Annex 1, is largely embodied by the so-called Group of 77 or G77. And within that, there are a few large influential negotiating blocs, one of which is AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. They were instrumental in getting the 1.5 degree goal cemented in the Paris Agreement. The LDCs, which are the least developed countries, largely a lot of African countries, that really, like AOSIS, contributed minimally to the problem, but are likely to be among the first to experience its impacts, and therefore put a huge premium on both the mobilization of finance and on adaptation, supporting them in terms of adaptation. Another really big and important group is the basics, the Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And these are the major emerging economies of the non-Annex 1 countries. They hold incredible clout politically, economically, and oftentimes don't have, obviously, the same interests as, say, AOSIS or the LDCs or others. And so all these dynamics are playing out across all range of issues in the negotiations. And you can see that leading up to Paris, each kind of negotiating bloc had their own, for lack of a better phrase, pet issue that they were really concerned with. And this is an oversimplification, to be sure. So please, take it with a grain of salt. But the EU was really concerned with the so-called emissions gap, where we are as a world in terms of what we're emitting versus where we need to be to reach what at the time was the 2 degrees Celsius global goal that was really put forward in Copenhagen. The umbrella group, which we, the US, are a part of, was really concerned about that differentiated transparency requirement that sort of perpetuated that firewall between developed and developing countries in Copenhagen. We really wanted to make sure that that did not persist, in particular for, like I said, a lot of those basic countries and other major emerging economies that did have the capacity to take more ambitious action. As I mentioned, the Africa group, very concerned with adaptation, and the islands and the least developed countries were really concerned with something called loss and damage. So basically, this notion that major historical emitters bear a responsibility, a moral responsibility, but also a scientific one, they would argue, for the losses and damages that they have incurred over time, and therefore we're seeking financial compensation for that, which was a non-starter for a lot of large historical emitters. The basics and like-minded developing countries, which again were a lot of the OPEC countries, always lean on this framework of equity, which in the UN context means something very different than what it does in the EJ conversations that we're having at home. That was really thinking about kind of a framing that would allow them to sort of develop their economies in ways that they saw fit, that frankly the US and EU and Japan and Australia were able to do over a century, and wanted to make sure that they could lift their folks out of poverty by using the same technology, fossil fuel-based technologies that we have. And finally, the finance piece. And I mentioned that was always a centerpiece, and this mobilization of $100 billion per year by 2020 was really a crux of the negotiations. And importantly, you'll see Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, now carrying this baton forward, but importantly, not focusing exclusively on public finance. He's really, focused on getting private sector finance off the sidelines. He'll say that there are billions of dollars available in public finance, but there are trillions of dollars in venture capital and private equity finance that needs to come off the sidelines to address this. And the photos I show here, well, the top one is just the delegation room for the US, a real behind the scenes look at what goes on in trying to make the negotiations. And if you squint your eyes, you can see Brian Deese and a few other folks who are now in the administration. And in the bottom is just a photo of what one of these so-called breakout groups looks like in the negotiations. You basically have a screen up and you're all negotiating text under a facilitated dialogue. So what is the Paris Agreement? I think it's important to sort of dispel some notions of what it is and what it is not. And one of the things it is not is a job killer. And I think that's an important thing to sort of just acknowledge off the bat. But it does have some new and ambitious targets. The first of which was the kind of cementing of the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming level by 2100. That was really pushed by the small island states. They frankly said, look, we cannot bring home and sell a new international climate regime that does not have 1.5 degrees Celsius, because anything beyond that may very well be an existential loss for our sovereignty. So Palau in these negotiations carries as much clout in many ways as the United States or China, and they exercise that by getting that in there. It also basically required every country to put forward an increasingly ambitious target every 5 years. So there was this no backsliding clause, so a constant ratcheting up of ambition over time. It required that all countries report and be reviewed on the implementation of those targets. So this was a huge win for the umbrella group. Remember I said they wanted to get rid of the differentiation between developed and developing countries in this space. The increased focus on adaptation and the real commitment to mobilize finance were also two very central components of the agreement, all of which satisfy different negotiating needs. So if you map this to the slide I presented just previously, you'll see that each group was able to kind of carry forward some of their own particular interests. So why did Paris succeed when, for previous 25 years, the UNFCCC failed to come to agreement? Well, there are a number of factors at play. The first is that, frankly, the kind of the ambient environment had changed, right? So a lot of the technological costs were coming down, which made the renewable energy much more cost competitive and therefore much more economically feasible and not as daunting perhaps. It was also durable. These 5-year ratchet up cycles made sure that countries come back to the table on a regular basis. It was inclusive, all countries act. It really made sure that while it acknowledged that different countries have different capabilities, it made sure that everyone put something forward. And that goes to the next one, this sort of bottom-up approach, which was the complete antithesis of the Kyoto model, where now you have everyone coming forward with a nationally determined contribution. And the idea here is that, countries are going to put forward their best foot because they don't want to be named and shamed in the public arena. And so there was a very real effort of peer pressure that comes into play in putting forward something that was both practical, but also ambitious. And finally, in many ways, most importantly, was the political will. Secretary Kerry and President Obama invested an enormous amount of diplomatic capital into climate change. And this really manifested itself in our relationship with China in particular. And when you have the world's 2 largest economies, the world's 2 largest greenhouse gas emitters coming together with an understanding of the broad framework, it really kind of greases the wheels for everything else to kind of fall into place underneath it. There was still enormous complexities that had to play out, but having that investment of diplomacy on both sides leading up to that was really important. So where are we in terms of our progress? Every year leading up to those negotiations, the so-called Conference of the Parties that happens at the end of every calendar year, the UN Environment Program releases what's called an emissions gap report. And this is the one from this past fall. And you can see that it shows a different emissions pathways starting in 2015 under different assumptions. The gray shading showing sort of if 2010 policies that were in place at that time were just kind of held steady. The blue line shows where we currently are if just what's already on the books just stays in place and nothing new happens. The orange and red dots here in 2030 basically reflect what is embedded in the nationally determined contribution. So what have countries put forward? And the difference between this unconditional and conditional scenario goes back to that provision of finance that I mentioned. And so a lot of developing countries said, okay, we'll put forward this target, but if you developed countries are able to provide us with additional finance and other resources, then we can ratchet up our ambition and go down to this red level. But you can still see the difference between this orange or red and the emission scenarios that are consistent with a 2C warming or a 1.5C warming is still significant. You're looking on the order of, somewhere between, 12 to 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is staggering, right? And so what this means is that we are not yet on a path that is consistent with 2 degrees or certainly 1.5 degrees warming. That's not a surprise, but it does reflect that more work needs to be done. So what if we zoom out a bit to 2100? This is work put forward by Climate Action Tracker. That's a really helpful website in sort of assessing where we are, both globally and also at a national level in terms of making progress on our various commitments. And you can see a similar plot, right? You have historical emissions, warming that would have happened without any global climate action, and then different policy scenarios, right? And you can see going out to 2100 that, if we're going to reach 2C or 1.5C, we need to be have net zero emissions before we in the second half of this century. And it's important to kind of keep in mind, right? The last plot that I showed ended at 2030, so right here, right? And so what we see is that a lot remains unknown, right? And not just, what countries are going to put forward in terms of their targets, but also how are we as a global society going to actually act and respond? Are we going to meet those targets? Is there going to be a breakthrough technology that allows for even greater ambition, or like a step change in progress? So let's move forward and zoom in a little bit to the United States. So again, this is some work that the Climate Action Tracker has put forward, and it shows historical emissions in the United States. The red circle there is kind of the reference year against which the US makes their targets. This black line in 2020, this black bar, was what our pledge was in Copenhagen, in the range of 17% below 2005 levels. And in Paris, this bar here in 2025 represents the 26 to 28% below 2005 levels that we pledged to put forward. And what you see in between here are two different suites of scenarios. The dotted line represents projected emissions prior to COVID, and this blue range represents the range of emissions post-COVID. And so you see, as you've probably read in the news, a significant drop in emissions in 2020 as a result of COVID-related economic activity. And it's not dissimilar to the decline we saw in 2008, 2009, when that financial crisis hit. And there was a slight rebound that happened in 2010, similarly to what they project to happen this year, but it doesn't resume to the historical levels for a variety of reasons. And here, a big reason was because natural gas was displacing coal-fired power plants. Over here, it's likely because in large part, you're going to have a lot of changes in vehicle mile traveled and other economic activity. And it's important to note that the US also, at least under the Obama administration, had put forward a mid-century target that was 80% below 2005 levels in 2050. And the argument there was that that was not only consistent with the Waxman-Markey legislation that failed to pass, but also broadly consistent with what at the time we thought were a 2C global goal, reaching net zero emissions in the latter half of the 21st century. You can see the quasi-subjective grading that the Climate Action Tracker assesses to these different targets and different ambition levels. I won't get into detail about it here, but encourage you to go to their website and play around with different countries and different levels of global ambition. But I just wanted to kind of orient ourselves to kind of where we are in terms of global climate action and the US climate action, because this manifests itself then in the policy space, right? And so in 2013, President Obama unleashed his climate action plan that, among other things, described a slew of ambitious actions that would help decrease emissions and increase resilience across the American economy. Some of that was in the form of making sure that our electricity generation sector could be decarbonized. Some of it obviously manifested itself in more stringent CAFE standards for light duty vehicles. And there were a number of other actions and policy measures that were taken to try and send a signal, frankly, to industry that this is the direction we're going. And you saw that manifest on subnational scales as well. You had obviously the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, had been in effect for quite a while, but gained increasing steam. You saw new partnerships between, say, California and Quebec, and you saw a proliferation of states that were passing renewable portfolio standards. And I think now there's something like half the states in the country have renewable portfolio standards, including Maine. But of course, then there was the next era, and this is when President Trump came into power. It was clear that climate change was not going to be a priority of that administration, and they took a number of moves, executive actions, just like the Obama administration did, to be consistent with their policy framework. They withdrew us from the Paris Agreement. They deprioritized the issue globally. They repealed the Clean Power Plan, changed the use of the social cost of carbon, rolled back a slew of standards, whether it was methane-related ones or appliance efficiency ones. They froze the CAFE standard tightening that was in effect. So a number of things were happening that sent the complete opposite signal to not only the world, but also to industry as well. And so in many ways, when the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement and deprioritized the issue globally, it sort of gave an out for the rest of the world. And that is really, really important when, as I go back to that first slide, right? This all depends on ambitious collective action. And so when we're sending a signal that this issue isn't important, it really then, provides an excuse for others not to act ambitiously. And of course, then, now we have the Biden administration. And, unsurprisingly, on day one, as they campaigned on, climate was going to be one of the key priorities. And so rejoin the Paris Agreement, reinstitute the social cost of greenhouse gases. They're holding a climate leaders summit on Earth Day this year to release our new nationally determined contribution. So signaling that we're, climate leaders globally once again, and a number of very ambitious targets and commitments that go beyond even that 2050 target I mentioned earlier. But this kind of, this policy pendulum that we've seen over time going back from the Clinton administration just keeps happening, and almost on greater scales in terms of greater magnitude. And so it remains to be seen how this is going to play out in the future. But you see this play out in kind of a microcosm just with what happened at General Motors over the past, probably 6 months or so. In October, they sided with Trump in their fight. And then when the election became clear, they changed their tune. And, even more recently, they flipped all the way and said, we're not going to produce internal combustion engines after 2035. So, obviously this didn't happen overnight at GM. They were scenario planning like any smart city planner or corporate boardroom would do. And they saw the writing on the wall, and they're sending a signal now to everybody else that this is the direction they're going in. So why the change, right? Well, part of it is economics. This is an image from the EPA's Climate Impacts and Risk Analysis report that was included in the National Climate Assessment that really shows climate impacts in the United States by economic sector under a high warming scenario, so-called RCP 8.5, and under a lower warming scenario, so-called RCP 4.5. And the difference between the dark shading and the light shading in these plots is really how much economic savings can be realized if you follow a lower warming path than a higher warming path. And so for labor and extreme temperature mortality, you see extraordinary, 50% or more cost savings by following that lower warming path on the order of, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so, there's certainly an economic case for climate action to be made in terms of costs not realized. But it's also, there's also a kind of an industry component to this as well, right? Here you have kind of a temporal plot of the levelized cost of energy going back to 2009. It's a little busy, but the point is that roughly renewables are getting cheaper over time, right? And this is no surprise, but you see, especially if you look at solar energy, where it was in 2009 and where it is now, it's remarkable. And there are a number of reasons for that. In part, it was, US investment in, say, DOE's Sunshot Initiative as part of the stimulus funding from 2008, 2009. that helped with that. There was a lot of private sector innovation. It was tax cuts that were provided to renewable energy companies for research and development. And it was, frankly, municipalities and states, sending that signal through their renewable portfolio standards. And so now you have wind and solar that is cost competitive with natural gas. And so we have the tools in our tool chest now. So why are we still, encountering some resistance to action? Well, the following probably 6 or 7 slides are a bunch of maps of the US, and these are all put together from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. If you haven't dug around their website, I'd strongly encourage it. There's a lot of really kind of fun information and pretty insightful. And the narrative I'm about to tell is something that if you've ever heard Catherine Hayhoe give a talk, she'll say something similar. But it goes to show that and this was, I think this data is from last year. So you're looking at now the estimated percentage of adults who think global warming is happening. So we're up over 70% of adults in the US think that global warming is happening. So that's a pretty big increase from where we were, a decade ago. Do they think it will harm plants and animals? Yes, again, over 70%. Do you think it will harm future generations? Yes. So there's this intergenerational concern that they have and recognition. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? Again, a slight decline. You can start to see some geographic trends emerging. Interestingly, you can also see where a lot of college towns are in this map as well. And you're upwards of 2/3 of Americans think it's going to harm people in developing countries. Do you think it's going to harm people in the United States? You start to see a little bit of a decline. Again, important geographic considerations at play here as well. Do you think it's going to harm you personally? And then it plummets to less than half of Americans think global warming is going to harm them personally. And so this actually means that we have a job ahead of us. And that job is to make climate change a local issue. And that's something we really sought to do in the context of the National Climate Assessment. We went around the country, hosted a bunch of regional engagement workshops to talk to people, understand what they enjoy about living in their given region, and how climate change is going to affect the things they care about. Telling those narratives, those personal stories about how climate change is going to affect them should, in theory, catalyze more action by having a greater capacity of people raising the issue. And so by building on things like NOAA's state climate summaries, we were able to create the National Climate Assessment in a way that really focused on these regional narratives. And we're doing that at home as well, right? So the University of Maine, the Climate Change Institute, and a number of other actors started this back in 2009 by working on Maine's climate future. They updated it in 2015 and again in 2020 as part of the Maine Climate Council's work. And you have a really remarkable assessment of how climate change is going to affect life, livelihoods, and well-being throughout the state. And we've got ambitious climate action happening as well. And so this list, I won't go through all of them, but obviously since Governor Mills has come into office, an enormous amount has been done in terms of getting our RPS into the books, joining the US Climate Alliance, introducing legislation to limit fluorinated gases, which are super pollutants when it comes to climate change. And importantly, things like the law to implement 100,000 new heat pumps, including financial support. The Efficiency Maine Trust was a really important policy lever to kind of institute that would allow and facilitate what otherwise may be unattainable climate action in many respects. And it also established the Maine Climate Council, which I know a number of folks on this call have been engaged in. I won't go into great detail of it, but do want to highlight that there were 2 subcommittees formed: the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, which you saw the reports on, but also this Equity Subcommittee. And this really set apart, and it struck me as really pretty novel and important, because this is not something that most other states that have done climate assessments have done. And I think it's incredibly important and a model for the rest of the country to follow. And there were obviously a number of working groups as well that were more sectorally focused. And the work of these subcommittees and this working group over the span of a little more than a year during a pandemic was nothing short of remarkable. And their work continues to this day. And I just highlight a few of the products that came out of the Maine Climate Council that, again, despite the pandemic, really sought public engagement, input, and feedback into the products. And I suspect that everybody involved wanted to do more of it. And I suspect with the mandate for this to be revisited every 4 years, you'll see that happening in the near future as we come back to doing things in a bit more of a normalized way. And all of this culminated in Maine Won't Wait, right? Our ambitious new state climate action plan that laid out 8 or 9 different strategies that were underpinned by a number of objectives and specific actions that talk about not just emissions mitigation in various sectors, but also importantly to highlight how emissions mitigation and climate action is not a job killer, but can actually be a job grower. And I think that's something that you're hearing more and more from leaders. And I think you're starting to see, frankly, proof in the pudding that you can decouple emissions declines with economic growth. That I think is a really important thing to carry forward. But it doesn't stop at the state level. I know we've got Troy Moon and Julie Rosenbach and Lucy Perkins on the line, I think, from Portland and South Portland, respectively. And so we've got some municipal level climate action planning happening as well. And it started with, understanding where the sources of our emissions coming from. And, consistent with sort of where we are as a state, actually, I should highlight there a little bit of a difference in terms of the emissions profile from the state versus the city level, where you have only about 1/3 of emissions in Portland and South Portland coming from on-road transportation, whereas in the state, that is over 50%. But this sort of lays the foundation to understand kind of where we can attack the issue of at least emissions mitigation at a municipal level. But it's also important to understand what our vulnerability is to climate impacts more broadly. And this is a really well done vulnerability assessment that mapped out kind of top 10 climate vulnerabilities. And you can see an increasing focus on adaptation as we get to these more localized levels, from the global to the local. And while a lot of these, you can take this list and go to pretty much any municipality in the country or even around the world, and you'll see a lot of these things pop up. There are ones that are, somewhat unique to the area, right? The first one in particular, the release of hazardous waste. If you know the South Portland area, you'll know these regions highlighted on the cover from sea level rise inundation have a lot of tank farms from petroleum and petroleum derived products. And so they're obviously at risk of inundation from sea level rise. So with that emissions baseline understanding and with that vulnerability assessment, you can then develop a joint municipal climate action plan that encompasses 6 big moves. I think probably the first joint municipal climate action plan in the country, and really kind of laying the foundation for additional work to come. But it's not just, you can go a level further, even more granular to, we've talked about global, we've talked about national, we've talked about state and local, and now let's look at the organization level action. There are coalitions, whether they're business coalitions, nonprofit coalitions, or even academic coalitions to catalyze climate action. And you also have national level NGOs, many of which are represented here in the state of Maine. And we, of course, come to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, which is my 80-person nonprofit on the waterfront of Portland. And we're really focused on pioneering collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges, right? And so we've got 3 large areas of work in basic research in in particular fisheries science and fisheries management. We have a very large education program that reaches basically every middle schooler in the state of Maine in a given year to really help them understand what is happening in the Gulf of Maine, what it means to them, and how the changes that are unfolding will have implications for their lifetimes. And we have a really strong community team that has historically strong relationships with everyone from vessel level fishermen to chefs in restaurants and purchasers at grocery store chains to really understand kind of sustainable harvesting, developing of aquaculture as an economic growth opportunity, and to help municipalities as they develop their own community climate action plans. And so over the past couple of years, there's a growing recognition that a lot of the work that we're doing has a significant climate lens to it. And so they decided to launch a new climate center. And that's what I've been charged with directing. And so we started, I started this position back in August. And what I wanted to do was to really get an assessment of what's going on in the region, right? What are the other organizations doing in this space and how can we add value? It was a pleasant surprise to know that despite Maine being 1.3 million people, there are a number of kind of environmental stewardship NGOs all along the coast doing phenomenal work. And we want to work in partnership with them to make sure that we can really help the people that are driving Maine's economy adapt and address climate change in ways that allow them to lead into the future. And so that starts with an articulation of what the problem is. And that's really that climate change represents an existential threat to coastal communities as we know them. But it's important to know that it doesn't have to, right? There's an opportunity to be had, and we can ensure that coastal communities thrive in a warming world if we empower them to capitalize on climate action that's occurring at all scales, from global down to local. And we at GMRI are going to do that by leveraging our existing capacities in the domains of fishery science and management, seafood business innovation, aquaculture development, and coastal community resilience, while building new capabilities in the domain of climate policy, whether it's from the local to the global scale or in the development, implementation, or analysis of that. In the climate mitigation space, how can we decarbonize the seafood sector? How can we help electrify working waterfronts? And how can we, explore the potential for negative emissions approaches like kelp farming in the Gulf of Maine? But we also want to be in the business of helping people actually implement solutions. And so we're going to be involved in the climate finance domain as well, helping municipalities, helping other actors sort of unlock that finance and also kind of develop and implement different tools to understand, the climate-related risk of their investments, of their assets, and to design different structures for shared liability in terms of, say, offshore wind and fishermen, things of that nature. And the only way all of this is going to be successful is if we sustain engagement with our stakeholders throughout the process. Like I said, whether that is the individual lobstermen or our own elected leaders, whether it be at the local, state, or federal level. And the way we're going to do that in large part is to really understand how decisions are made, right? And we want to do this by translating, creating that in-house fundamental technical knowledge of how climate change is impacting the coastal and marine domain in the region, and translating that all the way into on-the-ground action. And from kind of a staffing perspective, you could think about that as sort of developing that technical expertise, whether it's downscaled sea level rise projections or the carbon footprint of seafood operations and products, delivering that technical information to our corporate and municipal partners to understand, how they can use it and to, get a better understanding of the nuanced challenges that they're grappling with, bring that information in-house, develop some adaptation and mitigation options for them, and then through that sustained engagement process, develop solutions that we can then work hand in hand to implement. And so that, in sum, is what we are aspiring to do at the Climate Center at GMRI. And I'll just conclude with a few thoughts, reflecting on kind of this broad spectrum of climate action. As I highlighted in the beginning, the magnitude of the challenge is enormous, both in terms of where emissions come from and frankly, what needs to happen still, not just in the emissions mitigation space, but importantly in the adaptation space to really bolster the resilience of communities to weather the impacts that are going to come regardless of whether we go to zero emissions tomorrow. But importantly, the momentum is building across all scales. It's not just a pendulum swing. You see it globally, you see it in boardrooms, you see it all across the board at different types of organizations. and that there's an increasing focus on adaptation at local levels. And I think that's really important to really catalyze that local level planning. But impediments to action still exist, right? And I go back to this, right? This plot that showed how people view global warming in the United States. Many of them still don't think it's going to affect them personally. And one of the most important things we can do is talk about it. And you see here that almost only a third of Americans talk about global warming, at least occasionally. That's something we really need to do more of if we're going to mainstream climate considerations into the actions that everyone takes. So with that, I want to thank you for listening and thank the Mitchell Center for the invitation, and welcome any comments or questions.
David, that was wonderful. Everyone, I'm Linda Silka, and I'm going to do the Q&A, but could we all just begin by sort of, he can't see us, but clapping for that great talk and thinking about all of the things that we learned from this. And one of the ways that you started out the talk is to say that this is really the mother of all collective action problems, and then led us through a lot of the different, not just issues, but timelines in terms of different things that have happened. And each of us knows a part of that, but we probably hadn't seen it all put together. And so your skill at putting all of these things together really helps us begin to think about, where are we at? Where are we going? What are the kinds of issues? And one of the things that's really interesting is that you are doing this now at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, for those of you who haven't had the good fortune to say, go to Becky's Diner, which is right nearby, it is very low to where the water is in the Atlantic. And an odd first question, perhaps, but how does that location affect what you're doing as a place, or also give opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question, Linda. Geographically, we are positioned in a relatively vulnerable place. There's no doubt about it. And I think, but what I will say is that the design of the building, when it was done, 20 years ago or so now, was really with the fishermen in mind, right? Our whole ethos was, and in large part has been, collaborative research. So working hand in hand with the fishermen, going out in the Gulf of Maine, whether it's ground fishermen or lobstermen or otherwise. And we wanted a place where they felt welcome and home. And so if you come on any given day to GMRI, it's not, it won't be surprising if you see fishermen laying out their nets on our large expansive lawn out back to dry them out. We do a lot of that work. And so, again, so part of it was by design. We really wanted to be, accessible to the people that we are serving. But it's true, we have, we face vulnerabilities like a lot of the waterfront does. And I know Troy in particular has, I'm sure, been given a lot of thought to what the future of the Portland waterfront looks like. And we see ourselves as really important stewards in that conversation as well. And I think we're constantly looking for ways to sort of leverage our facility to be, kind of a living classroom in many ways. We have the Cohen Center inside that provides this extraordinary interactive experience for students to really get some hands-on experience of what the Gulf of Maine means to them. But they could just look out the back windows or go out onto the back lawn and start to see, everything that can be impacted by that. So, so you're right. There's an opportunity, but also a risk associated with where we are, for sure, and we're taking advantage of it.
And it's really impressive how many of the middle school students in Maine are being touched by your work. many of us are learning more and more about the central presence, the programs that are being done by the Gulf of Maine Research Institute are having on students. If people wanted either to know more about that or wanted to, say, be a volunteer, or scientists wanted to be involved, what would you recommend that they do to learn more and be more involved?
Yeah, well, at least, with GMRI in particular, by all means, visit our website, shoot me an email. I think Ruth has put my contact information in the chat window, so feel free to reach out. There are any number of ways that we can do that. More broadly, outside of the realm of GMRI as an organization, and this will speak to a few comments or questions in the comment box. It is, a lot of it is talking about it, and it may seem, that you can't have that much impact simply by talking about it more and more, but at some point you reach a tipping point, right? And some point you have that conversation with the right people that have the, that control the levers of power and influence, or for whatever reason, or you catalyze your neighbors into action. It's no surprise that the draconian approach to climate change that the Trump administration took catalyzed extraordinary grassroots organizing and led to, say, the Sunrise Movement and other actions that ultimately resulted in ambitious policy discourse around, say, the Green New Deal. And for whatever you think about the Green New Deal, it was an important piece of the policy conversation because it really pulled that conversation. And you saw for the first time ever that climate change was a top 4 priority in a presidential campaign. That is remarkable. Back when Obama was running in 2008, climate change ranked something like, number 16 in the top 20 priorities among electors. And now it's a top 4 alongside COVID recovery, economic relief, and racial injustice. So for climate change to be that 4th one, we've come an extraordinary way in a short amount of time. Now, we've probably done that a little bit too late, but we need to do it at some point, and I think doing it now is really important.
You mentioned policy and policy recommendations, and a number of the questions that people are asking is, do you have 1 or 2 simple policy recommendations, say at the local level or regional level or national level, that we should grab onto, that we should be thinking about?
Yeah,
I know that's a hard one.
No, it's fine. I'm laughing a little bit because there's simple in the terms of what they are, and then there's simple in terms of actually implementing it, and those are 2 very different things. From a simple standpoint, any economist will tell you that a price on carbon is what you need and the most efficient way to get there. I am not an economist, but I remain somewhat skeptical that it'll work out the way we think it will. In part because if you look at some of the results of carbon pricing in Europe, it's been very difficult to get that price right. And of course, the second part of that is making sure that it's not a regressive tax, right? And making sure that you are either refunding or providing that dividend through a fee and dividend structure to make sure that those most vulnerable and disadvantaged among us aren't paying an outsized part of the piece. So I think, a carbon price coupled with, say, a national clean energy standard could be a very smart policy approach. But I think, at another level where you have, far more bipartisan support is in the efficiency realm. There is still a lot more we can gain in efficiency through everything we do, whether it's building efficiency, industrial efficiency, transportation efficiency. We're wasting an enormous amount of energy, and we're doing a lot of great work in the state and at local levels with that, and I think you're starting to see that again at national levels as well. The other thing I'll just say, not a simple policy recommendation, but including climate considerations into Zoning is also really important as municipalities kind of develop and plan for their next comprehensive planning process. It's going to be really important to think about how climate considerations can be taken into account to plan accordingly.
Another interesting thing about your talk is you brought in a number of different disciplines and their importance that they've been playing. Just now you were talking about economists. If you were one of the students who's on this, their names are showing up, they're listening to your talk, would you, in your role as somebody who's, really seen things from all different levels and played important roles, would you have any recommendations for them in terms of what disciplines they might want to think about or what activities they might want to be involved in terms of policy that would help prepare them for the world you're helping think about in terms of addressing this problem?
It's I won't tell you who this person was, but there was a very famous scientist who was a visiting scholar at University of Washington and took a lot of us grad students out to lunch. And I remember she went around the table and she asked everybody what they want to do. And everybody said, I want to be a researcher, I want to be a researcher, I want to be a researcher. She came to me and I said, I really want to do science policy. And she said, why in God's name would you want to do that? And I said, well, it just seems like there's a real need for it. And she said, you really need to establish your credentials and become an expert in something before you make that pivot. And that really stuck with me over time, and I really struggled with that because I knew I didn't want to be a researcher coming out of grad school. And I was fortunate to have an advisor that recognized my interest in sort of bridging the science policy space and encouraged me to kind of pursue things like take coursework in the public policy school or the School of Marine Affairs or environmental health or wherever else. And then, gave me opportunities to testify in front of the state legislature and things like that, that really just kind of helped me kind of articulate what the issues were, why we care about them, and how we could bring science into the policy discourse. And so every career step I took thereafter was really informed by the experience that I had to, I love science and I love, staying abreast of it, but I realized that I really wasn't the best at doing it, and that's okay, and I think that's really important for us to recognize and appreciate that everybody is adding value to this space. And so I would just say, get smart, get involved and stay abreast on what's going on. And those three small things can actually really position you well.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all that you've said today and helping us learn so much for us to learn and to really keep reminding us that we can all make a difference. It's important for everybody to be involved. And on that last theme, everyone, I hope you'll look at the names. You can see, on your screen, the names of the people that are here today. And I hope you'll pick out one or two people that you kind of know and send an email to each other and say, this is what I learned. This is what I want to do. And I hope that you'll also tonight, when you go home or when you email with friends and colleagues and family, you'll say, I heard this really, really interesting science policy person who taught me three things. And think about what you learned and go back and watch this again, because if you're like me, you got 10% of it, maybe 20, but you want to try and get 100%. So David, thank you. And everyone, thank him in any way that you can. Take care. I think we're done. David Hart, do you have any last things that you need to say or want to say?
Nope, just a wonderful job, Dave. That whole space between knowledge and action that you've been thinking about, obviously even longer ago than I realized, is a space a lot of us are trying to work in. We can learn from you, and we look forward to collaborating with you. Nice work.